Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be talking about Scream 5, which has just been greenlit, and the continuation of the Scream series post Wes Craven, which is very odd to me. Now, it also has been confirmed that David Arquette is going to be returning for his role in the series as the character of Dewey, and also, Sidney Prescott, who's played by Neve Campbell, is rumored to be a character that is coming back, and Neve Campbell has stated that she may return. There is no word on Courtney Cox. I don't know if her character was killed off in any of the later films, but no word on that as of yet. But David Arquette is confirmed to come back, which I think kind of squashes the idea that maybe this is a reboot. Now, to go back to the beginning of the development of Scream 5 has been rumored for a very long time after Scream 4 was released, and I believe that was 2013. And after that, I think Scream 5 had been in development, but then unfortunately Wes Craven passed away, so they chose not to continue that franchise at that point in time. And the film has basically sat in development hell for the last 5 years. Now, the directors of last year's Ready or Not, which was kind of a horror comedy type of thing, those two are going to be directing Scream 5, or they have been hired on to do it. Now, I don't have a problem with the directors. I think Ready or Not had a fairly good, it had a fairly good reception by audiences and critics. I don't think anybody outright hated it. I don't think it was anything amazing or groundbreaking, but it was a solid movie. So I understand bringing those guys over kind of makes sense in a way, even though Scream is kind of supposed to be a meta horror film as opposed to a comedy horror film. So I don't know if they're going to try and implement some of those elements into it. Now there are some funny stuff in the Scream series. David Arquette himself playing the bumbling Dewey is among one of he's a comic relief character for the most part. Even though he does have a main role in the story. They spoofed him in Scary Movie, and which was obviously pretty funny. But for some reason, that's the interpretation I always bring my brain back to instead of the actual Scream film. But the thing is that as the Scream films progressed, and as we progressed through this universe, they've gotten more and more corny. They've gotten less and less quality over time. Like the first Scream film, it was a gimmick horror movie. And I hate to say that because I do love Wes Craven. I think Wes Craven is an amazing director, especially when it comes to his horror films. But the problem is that when you move into Scream is when he had literally directed every horror thing he could think of, and he literally moved into a horror film inside of a horror film. He couldn't do anything more inside the box, so he had to think outside the box. But the problem is, when you go the meta route, it really only works for one film. I don't think that the Scream formula worked in the sequels, because the first one had an interesting little twist at the end where it turns out the boyfriend and whatever, he's the one that's actually been killing people, and his buddy, and a bunch of other stuff. So, there's a lot of twists and turns in that movie that makes sense, and at least in hindsight, but, they work well for that film. Now, the problem is when you get to the sequels, is that they try and do that kind of thing again, where like, oh, who did it? Who's the killer? Who's impersonating Ghostface? But it's like, every other slasher franchise that you see, for the most part, has a main villain that stays with the series for a majority of its run. Now, that villain might not be necessarily in the first movie, again, a la, Friday the 13th, but Jason's still in 9 out of the first 10 films as an adult, killing people. But Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, who obviously is another, series that Wes Craven has done. Child's Play. There's a whole bunch of slasher series that exist and have iconic killers. But the problem with Ghostface is Ghostface has been played by a bunch of different people. And I think that draws away from the idea of people getting attached to it. People get more attached to the costume than the killer themselves. And again, basically all the Scream sequels kind of deal with some kind of a copycat killer from the originals. I feel like making a fifth one, you've already beat the horse to death, and now you're digging it up to beat it again. Don't do any more of those type of films. I think that the two directors from Ready or Not should be going and doing some original properties. They did really good with the horror comedy route. That's a popular genre right now. Go with something that isn't attached to a franchise tag, that has expectations to it. Bring something new to the screen as opposed to just bringing back the same old shit that we've seen 10 times before. And again, like I said, I hate to say that about the Scream series too, because I really do love the first film. I thought the first film was very good. It was very pertinent. The opening of that film is legendary. Just seeing Drew Barrymore get gutted, but again, as you move into the sequels, it gets progressively less and less of the idea wears. It wears on you that these people know they're in a horror film and yet they keep dying. Although some of them do tend to survive, the Neve Campbell and David Arquette and Courtney Cox, they seem to keep surviving these films. But that's the other weird thing about the Scream series is that it's usually the opposite for a slasher series in the sense that in Friday the 13th and Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, you might have one character that sticks around for a little while or for at least a few movies. You can look at Laurie Strode from Halloween or Tommy Jarvis from Friday the 13th or Nancy Thompson from Nightmare on Elm Street. But they don't stay around for very long, and most of the time they wind up dead. Except for, actually Jamie Lee Curtis, they did kill her off at one point. But basically, all those characters wind up dead at some point. And you really get more attached to the killer in terms of watching him do what he does, rather than the victims. You kind of just want to see the victims die, except, there's a few examples in there where you don't. But in the Scream series, they did the opposite. They kept the victims around for multiple films and just kept replacing the killer as the killer was killed off in multiple films. So it literally did the opposite of what the 80s did. And I think that's another thing that kind of counts against it in the long run, is that formula I don't think necessarily lasts, because we get bored of those characters in terms of after you get past the first or second film, because they've kind of reached their pinnacle. It's one of those stories like, oh, they're at different points in their lives and, the killer comes back and whatever. But the problem is that, it's a cookie cutter interpretation. It's like at some point, these characters are going to survive through the film because they've survived through 4 films already. So you take away the tension. Whereas in a traditional slasher film, generally that the slasher is probably going to die at the end, because that's normally what happens. Or they're going to do, one of those little jump scare moments at the end where you think the guy's dead and he leaps up or something like that. But I don't think it's a good idea to keep continuing on with these slasher franchises, because you're just going to get the same backlash you got in the early 90s when people kind of got sick of it. I think there's still a level of burnout from slasher films to an extent. I think that if you have an original idea and you have something that you can put to screen and you have something that's not necessarily aping off something else, or at least not to a degree where it's noticeable, then yeah, go do that. If it happens to be a slasher film, great. But don't keep dragging up old franchises again, like Blumhouse has been doing, and just trot them out in front of an audience and expect people to clap. That's not what you do. That's the Jeb Bush approach, and that does not work. So I don't like the idea of them continuing on with this franchise, and at the same time, I think they're wasting the potential of the directors that they now have on the books. And I kind of hope that maybe this kind of drops out and those directors maybe get picked up for something a little bit better, because like I said, you're better off getting something original to screen, even if it might fail. You're better off getting something original to screen that you can develop further than dragging on a franchise that died years ago. That's the other thing too, is that the Scream franchise, I think maybe between Scream 1 and 2, there might have been a small period of time, but between all the other ones, between 3 and 4 especially, there were long stretches of time. So it's not like when you had the old slasher films where, Friday the 13th had 8 movies come out between 1980 and 1989. That's insane. Or Nightmare on Elm Street was the same way. Halloween was a bit more spaced out, but they were kind of clumped together for the most part, in little clusters. But the thing is that a lot of the really good franchises have stayed afloat because they kept pumping stuff into, they kept pumping media into people, into the fans, uh, over a short period of time, as opposed to letting people forget about it. I think that's probably half the reason why Scream 4 did not do very well at the box office, from what I recall. But I expect the same from Scream 5, unless they trim that budget down to something that's so minuscule that they're literally just paying the crew and the actors, and they have to borrow the camera equipment. Because again, I don't think there's a market right now for slashers for the most part, unless you're doing something original. Halloween may be the only exception because Blumhouse somehow managed to hit that nail on the head when they missed every other one. Which I think is also going to wind up coming back and biting them in the ass when Halloween Kills comes out later this year, and then Halloween Ends comes out next year. So we're going to see a lot of stuff going on there. But that's my opinion on Scream 5. As for David Arquette coming back, that's kind of a given, I guess, if you're going to do another one of these movies, because he obviously has nothing better to do with his time. But I want to know what you think. Do you think that Scream should get a fifth entry? Do you think that this is kind of just dragging a dead franchise through the mud, as I do? And are you excited? Are you or are you not excited that David Arquette is coming back to reprise his role, and Neve Campbell may be coming back to reprise her role? Again, put your thoughts in the comments below. I like to read them. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?